And while pursuing her MDiv, she served on as a volunteer assistant coach for Baylor women's soccer. Latterly, she's worked for Baylor's Faith and Sports Institute as the high school retreat director and assistant of online programming. She's currently pursuing a PhD in social psychology in Baylor's Department of Psychology and Neuroscience, working with Dr. Sarah Schnitker's Science of Values Laboratory. Elizabeth's broadly interested in virtues, character development, spirituality, and she lives with her husband Jackson in Waco, Texas. Ladies and gentlemen, Elizabeth Tan.
Thank you, Andy, for the introduction, and it is one of the greatest honors of my life to be Andy Parker's adopted daughter. So I'm thrilled to be here. Truly so grateful and delighted to be here with you all. I love this community so much. I myself am a product of this community, having competed in sports all of my life. Really how I came to know who God is and therefore who I am has been in the context of sports and sports ministries. So fun and sweet to be with you all. I'm very excited to talk and learn together this morning. So I want to start with a story. So imagine that a team and their coach are getting ready for practice. Players are getting taped in the athletic training room, getting last-minute snacks, loosening up their cleats, slipping in their shin guards. And the coach is in her office, reviewing her practice plans, skimming her scouting report for that week's game, and focusing on what she wants her team's energy to be that day at training. Suddenly there's a knock on her door, and it's one of her players, and she wants to have a quick word. Her player asks her coach, "Coach, I was wondering if you could tell me what I need to do to earn a starting spot." The coach responds with a predictable list of suggestions. You need to be fit. You need to be good in the air. You need to be strong, physical, hold-off defenders. The player responds, "Coach, I can do all of those things. I know I've been doing those things all season long. I've been coming early, I've been staying late. I know I can do all of those things in a match." The coach, looking at her player, loved her player. And so she said to her, "I think you're right, but you lack one thing. Your attitude's not right. Because for you, this season is all about you, when really it should be all about the team. So show me that you can support and encourage your team in the role that you're in." The player was disheartened, and she left her coach's office with a gloomy, fallen face, very sorrowful, for she really hated the role that she was in. So I tell this story because I want to illustrate 2 points out of the gate. The first thing that I want to emphasize is that leaders have unique opportunities to know what people really want. And they often have the power to give it to them or not. Leaders get to know what their teams really desire and value and ultimately want. And sometimes not, they can give it to them. And secondly, leaders have unique opportunities to point people to better goals, to a better way. Leadership, by definition, involves influence, and part of that influence comes in helping people orient their deep desires and values in a God-honoring way. And so I think these two ideas, the ideas that leaders get to know what their teams really, really want and value, and then help them orient those desires and values in a God-honoring way, that sets up the big idea that I want us to think about this morning, which is that Christian leaders in sports have unique opportunities to support the development of virtues in their teams. And so for the rest of this talk, when I say teams, I want that to mean whatever it means for you. So if you're a coach, your team is your players. If you're an administrator, your team is your staff. If you're a chaplain, your team might be to whom you're ministering. If you are an academic, perhaps your team or your students. So this is where we're going to go during our time together. First, I want to discuss how Christianity is a key context for virtue development in people. Then I'm going to discuss how athletic contexts can either support or inhibit the development of virtues in people, depending on a variety of variables. I'm going to zoom in on one variable, and that's leadership. And I'm going to make the argument that leadership is the crux. It's a crucial variable as to whether sports will be a character-enhancing activity. And then lastly, we'll get practical, and I'm going to discuss 4 examples of virtues in sport, how they're enacted, and how they're cultivated. So first, I want to describe how religion and spirituality are a key context that can encourage the cultivation of virtues. But first, I think we need a little background on what a virtue is. So I want to explore this question, what are virtues? I'm going to do it through the lenses of 3 different disciplines quickly. So a philosophical perspective. Ancient Greek philosophers were apt to ask questions like, what is the meaning of life? What is the goal of humanity? And they landed on this answer that the goal of humankind is to flourish, eudaimonia. And to flourish means to live virtuously. Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, argued that a virtue is this golden mean. It's a perfect balance between 2 vices, a vice of excess and a vice of deficiency. This is going to get a little more clear towards the end when I go through some examples of virtues, but just as a preliminary example, the virtue of courage is intentionally taking action despite risk for a worthwhile goal. And virtue of courage perfectly balances a vicious excess of recklessness and a vicious deficiency of passivity. So the term virtue comes from the Latin virtus, which means strength or excellence. So virtue is essentially an excellent strength of character. It is the right act facing an appropriate object in a right time and place with a moral motive and means. So that's philosophy at 30,000 feet. Christian theology also has a particular treatment of virtues. Christian theological understanding of virtues has leaned a lot on St. Thomas Aquinas, who, in his Summa, he argues that grace is the context and reality that enables the enactment of virtues, and that we enact virtues in order to anticipate our supernatural destiny, a supernatural destiny that is budding in the present and fulfilled later on. So Christian theology has a very particular telos for humankind. Communion with God, Christ-likeness, redemption and restoration of creation. And so as a contemporary treatment of this, N.T. Wright in his book, After You Believe, argues a similar point that Christian living is active anticipation in the present of our eschatological reality. So I'm anticipating being with Christ and being like Christ by living virtuously now and following Christ now. So philosophy and theology are more teleological in nature. They're going to be more prescriptive regarding what a virtue is. Psychological science also offers us helpful insight into the question, what is a virtue? And it's more descriptive in nature, and it helps us understand how a virtue fits into the human person, the human personality system. So personality theory will note that people have traits. We have these non-contextual, non-conditional dispositional or bipolar lineal traits. So if I am a domineering person, I tend to be more dominant at home and at work and in my relationships. So people have traits that are pretty consistent across situations. People also do things depending on the situation, and these are called characteristic adaptations. And a characteristic adaptation is a motivational, developmental, cognitive, social pattern of behavior influenced by your traits depending on the situation. So these are our values. These are our goals. These are our mental schemas. These are cognitive reappraisals, emotion regulation. So these are ways we tend to act and behave based on the situation. So people have traits. They do characteristic adaptations, and people also adopt narrative identities. And these narrative identities are how we make sense of ourself, how we make sense of our life story, how we find meaning and coherence. Those are highly influenced by culture. So within personality theory, psychologists have classified a virtue as a characteristic adaptation rooted in a transcendent narrative identity. So a virtue is a way that I tend to think, behave, and respond based on a sense of self that is connected to something bigger than self. Psychologists have partnered with philosophers, rightly so, to define a virtue as a dispositional and deep-seated habit to act well for right reasons. Furthermore, psychologists have insight into how virtues are organized and work together so that human character isn't this nebulous bag of virtues, but instead virtues work together in a particular way. That virtues have a sibling virtue in which one virtue's vice of excess is another virtue's vice of deficiency. And so they counterbalance each other. So for example, courage and patience are sibling virtues, wherein courage's vice of excess is patience's vice of deficiency, recklessness. And courage's vice of deficiency is patience's vice of excess, passivity. So virtues can work together too. So virtue is this excellent habit to act well based on a sense of self that is transcendently connected. So that's some thorough background on virtues. But really, why do we care about that? And what does that have to do with Christianity? So I heard Bill Pupils in his presentation yesterday make the claim that humans want meaning and purpose and connection so desperately. And I agree with him. And so at the core of virtue development, what we have is that people want so badly to have meaning and purpose and connection and belonging. And a Christian theological answer to where you find that is in knowing God through Christ. And to know Christ is to follow Christ. And what happens is, it just so happens that in order to follow Christ, we typically have to enact these virtues. And then by following Christ, we end up spending a lot of time with Him, and doing that makes us more like Him and makes us more virtuous. So living out our deepest values by enacting virtues is how we follow Christ often, and what is going to make life meaningful to us. So where do religion and spirituality come into play? Religion and spirituality will imbue our behaviors with transcendent meaning and purpose. They will also provide us a community with practices that promote character development. So Christianity provides a particular meta-narrative and meta-identity for us. The Christian meta-narrative is a theo-narrative in which God has always chosen to be a God with people. He's never chosen to be a God without people. And it's not because of anything we do or bring to the table, it's because he loves us. And I know there's more to it than that, but there's certainly not less. And a Christian meta-identity is one in which we are created good. We're fallen in need of a Savior. And in following him, we're striving to live as Christ would live if he were us. Christianity provides a particular community, not unlike this one. Also, for example, the local church also provides traditional historical practices such as spiritual disciplines that can help promote character development. The gospel as our reality, just the context in which we exist, infuses our habits and strivings with transcendent meaning and purpose. So that is what a virtue is, why we care about it, and how religion is a key context that supports the development of virtues. Now I want us to transition to thinking about how sports, as a particular context, may or may not promote the development of virtues. So it is time for the million-dollar question. Do sports build character?
Yes.
And some full disclosure here, my gut reaction is yes. Like, that's my gut reaction too. Like, I want to be like, yeah, of course. And it's because I love sports. And sports have been really good to me and for me and still are. However, research does lead us to conclude that athletic context can either inhibit or promote virtuous behavior. There are some studies that show sports promote virtue development and others that show that athletic participation is related to negative outcomes in general, including negative character outcomes. And really, whether or not sports are going to build good character depends on the manner in which people engage and participate in sports. So there's a variety of variables at play. Some studies have shown that perfectionistic views of God, as well as a large discrepancy between God's expectations of me and my abilities, leads to poor mental health and virtue outcomes. Having really highly contingent self-worth, meaning my sense of dignity as a human is staked upon my performance in this particular activity, as well as having a self-narrative that if I don't perform, then I'm not worth anything. Those lead to poor outcomes. Dave Johns is doing some cool work in self-narratives, and his presentation is tomorrow. Other studies have shown that if your religion leads you to engage in cognitive reappraisal, so these are things like reframing how I think about the situation, or if your religion is leading you to engage in a lot of meaning making of your life and your situations, that promotes virtue development. But if your religion is highly perfectionistic, you have extremely high fear of failure and shame, that's not good for us. Other studies have shown that motivation really matters. Why am I engaging in these activities? A transcendent motivation leads us to be more likely to cultivate virtues like self-control and patience. So if the question is, do sports build character? The answer is yes. If we think of character as a morally neutral term. So sports are a morally forming activity. They're going to shape us either positively or negatively, depending on how we engage. I think the question that we all really care about is, do sports build good character? And the answer is sometimes no, sometimes yes. Sports are not going to build good character when they promote a culture of over-conformity, of positive deviance, where whatever it is to be an athlete is to be tough and hardworking, well then I'm going to be the toughest and the hardest working, even if I already have a sprained ankle. Maybe to the detriment of myself. Or if sports culture promotes sort of maladaptive normalization of emotions. This comes from Transcendent, who's also presenting tomorrow. When sports prioritize the act over the motive and the meaning, so the what over the why and the how, this can lead to an all or nothing mentality. Winning is everything, an idolatrous attitude, which does not promote virtue development. And when your narrative identity and sense of value as a human is contingent on how you perform, less likely to develop virtues. But sports do build good character when you have moral exemplars who can model these virtues. When there are moments of specific instruction of this is what this character strength means and looks like. When people are given opportunities to enact what they have learned and then reflect on how that went. Sports build good character by providing us opportunities to suffer well. Sports also will build good character when we are connected and rooted in a transcendent meta-narrative, when our motivations are rooted in a sense of self as connected to others and God. So sports sometimes do and sometimes don't build good character, and there's a lot of variables at play, as you can see. Now I want to zero in on one particular variable, and that is leadership. And I want to make the argument that leadership is a crucial variable as to whether sports are going to be a character-enhancing activity. Leaders, by cultivating virtues in your teams, you are helping people follow Christ and actively anticipate their telos. And leaders, by cultivating virtues in your teams, you are helping people live out their values and therefore live a purposeful, meaningful life. That is what we're doing here. So now I want us to think about some ways that leadership can promote character development in general. One thing leaders can do is make your purpose and values really salient for your team. So Andy mentioned that I was on staff with Baylor women's soccer for a couple of years. And I remember one preseason, we were just in the throes of it, the thick of it. You know, like you are just always tired, even the coaching staff. The girls are super sore. They've just been hitting each other like for the past 3 weeks. They just really want to play someone else instead of each other. And head coach at the time, Paul Jobson, we had a team meeting, he went up to the whiteboard and he drew this squiggly line on the whiteboard. And he said, "This is your motivation. Sometimes you feel motivated, other times you do not." And then he drew a straight line across the board. And he said, "This straight line, that is your purpose. Your purpose should be steady and anchoring you." And in doing so, he guided our players to reflect on their own purpose. Why are you doing this? This is hard. Everything hurts. Remember why you're doing this right now. Leaders can also offer time to reflect or give reminders and opportunities to process meta-narrative and values. So my hero to this day is my high school basketball coach, Coach Randall. And he is one of the most virtuous people I've ever known. He's a great coach, but he's a very, very good man. And we had this ritual, this activity that we would do at the end of every single practice. We'd finish practice and he would say, "Okay, nomination for hardest worker, nomination for best encourager." And you know, we're like adolescent girls, so it's like, "I thought Janae hustled really hard today." Or like, Devin really encouraged me today, and I know she was encouraging other people. But in this simple exercise, Coach Randall was emphasizing and instilling in us the values of hustle and encouragement. Little moments like that. Leaders can also embody virtues and model it for their teams. So Coach Randall, I actually only got to play for him for 1 year. He passed away suddenly while I was still in high school. And it was really hard and it was really sad. But I remember this article about him in the local newspaper, because he's a pretty big community member, he's really well known. And the journalist had interviewed a local referee and asked about Coach Randall to this ref who had officiated years of Coach Randall's games. And the referee said that the worst thing Coach Randall had ever said to him in his years of officiating was, "You were not kind to me tonight." The Coach Randall embodied a lot of virtues. Leaders can know their teams, love their teams, and point them to a virtuous way. So my soccer coach, who I talked about last night, Elise Sears, she, like many coaches, picks a theme for each season. So one of my years, I think it was my junior year, college soccer, our theme for that year was domestique. And where's Amy Meyer? Are there any other cyclists in the room? Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like, so domestique is the French term for servant, and it seems like there's this tradition within cycling where a cycling team will pick one of their cyclists to win a race, and then the job of everyone else is to make sure that that person wins. I got a couple nods, so I feel correct in this. Yeah.
That's good.
So, like, if you're the domestique, the person who is selected to serve, and you're not selected to win the race. Like, you're engaging in this very challenging cycling race, and you're not supposed to win. Like, you're supposed to draft and block, and like, if the person who's supposed to win, if your teammate's bike breaks, you're supposed to just give your bike to them. And she chose this theme for us. She pointed all of us to always choose your team over your own needs. And lastly, I just want to acknowledge that not everyone here is probably the head honcho. Like, not everyone is, setting the culture standard for everyone around you. I just want to acknowledge that. I know some of you are maybe more in a position where you're trying to provide an alternative in a hostile environment. And I just want to say that still matters. And you can still make a dent in that way. So far I have talked about what a virtue is, why it matters, and how Christianity is a key context for developing virtues. Talked about how sports can either develop or hinder virtues in people, and it depends on a lot of variables, especially leadership. Now I want to get practical. This is kind of the fun stuff. I want to talk about specific examples of virtues, what they look like in sports, and how we can develop them in athletic contexts. Courage. Courage is intentionally taking action despite risk, threat, often fear, for a meaningful, worthwhile goal. And I think courage comes out a lot in sports because courage helps us to keep from being paralyzed by fear of failure or fear of doing hard things. That photo is Clemson women's soccer doing fitness tests, doing the beep test, doing the yo-yo. And I think courage helps us to initiate and move forward when it's scary, when it's hard. There's actually some interesting, just as an aside, as an example of courage as an initiator, there's some cool research about how courage is really helpful in interracial relationships. courage and patience, how courage helps us to engage in an uncomfortable task, and patience helps us to keep going when it's still uncomfortable. Courage is virtue, perfectly balances vicious excess of recklessness and vicious deficiency of passivity. How is courage related to Christianity? I think that the reality that God's presence is with us can help us to do hard things. I also think our faith informs a lot of our goals and informs what is a meaningful, worthwhile goal to pursue, even when it's risky. How can leaders cultivate courage in their teams? So I'm going to say this, and I actually say this for each of the 4 virtues. You need to name it when you see it and when you need it. You need to call it by its name. And a lot of the times you need courage is when things are scary or hard. So, hey, I know you have a rivalry game this week, and I know you're feeling kind of nervous, kind of jittery, kind of afraid. Courage is going to help you lean in to this game. Or, hey, I know that we have our fitness test tomorrow morning. I know a lot of us are feeling a little bit nervous about that. Let's lean into our courage. Let's lean into courage right now and do this challenging thing. Or maybe you celebrate it when you see it. Celebrate the role player who steps up in a really big moment. Say, that was really brave, that was gutsy. Well done leaning into that moment. Courage is essentially doing hard things for really good reasons. Patience. Patience is waiting calmly during suffering or frustration. Patience is waiting well. Different examples of situations that require patience would be interpersonally, so annoying people, or daily hassles like waiting in long lines, or life hardships like maybe chronic illness or athletic injury. How patience plays out in sports is that patience allows us to pursue long-term goals well, and it allows us to wait and suffer well if we're injured or if we're not satisfied with the project that we're making in our craft. Patience is a perfect balance of a vicious excess of sloth, disengagement, passivity, and a vicious deficiency in just recklessness, reactivity. I think patience connects with Christianity because a Christian meta-narrative necessarily involves suffering and waiting. We're a part of a story that involves Christ suffering on our behalf. And we're also, like, our current reality is that we're waiting. We're waiting for Christ to return. You can tell a lot about a person by the way that they wait. So how can leaders cultivate patience in their teams? Name it when you need it and when you see it. You're waiting in line at the airport, or dinner is taking forever to come. Like, hey guys, we really need to be patient right now, or thank you so much for your patience with this, for waiting well during this situation. Or maybe you acknowledge that injured player who hasn't played in a game or actually trained in practice in months, and all they do is rehab every day. Like, acknowledge, like, hey, I know you're being patient with your comeback. And I just want to say, I see you being really patient and working hard in your recovery. Engaging in emotion regulation strategies is really helpful with patience. So trying to regulate impatience, frustration, anger is helpful for patience. So doing the little things like counting to 10, walking away from the conversation with the frustrating person, taking a deep breath and slowing out and blowing out really, really slowly is helpful. I also think it's helpful to recognize the good in other people even when they're being frustrating. So I had this teammate on my basketball team in college who, anytime anyone was being really annoying, what she would do is she would say, "You are a child of God, bought with the blood of Christ, full of potential." And it was just kind of her way of reminding herself, like, that person, however frustrating, still person, child of God, with God's image. And really, I think also, we haven't empirically tested this, but I would love to experimentally. I really think reflecting on all the ways that people have to be patient with us would also help us to be patient with others. And ultimately, God encompasses all virtues, but I think it's true to note that God has been so patient with his people throughout history. Humility. Now, I'm in science of virtues. That's what I do. And so virtues and character language is very salient for me. So whenever I'm at places like this and I hear virtues thrown out, my ears, they just automatically perk up. And I will say, I think that humility is the virtue I have heard the most the past couple of days at this conference. And I don't really have any interesting insight as to why that is. I just thought that was just a fascinating observation that I had. And what humility is humility is an accurate view of your limitations and shortcomings. Also coupled with a posture of teachability and modesty and a tendency to elevate other people. So how I think humility plays out in sports is that it provides us with a realistic view of ourselves. So if you are a role player, you would do well to consider why that is. And perhaps there are some good reasons for that. Or maybe if you're the star, instead of becoming overly arrogant, you might consider the ways that you still have limitations and try to address those. Also in admitting mistakes. Humility is the perfect balance between a vicious excess of self-deprecation and a vicious excess of arrogance, of excessive pride. And just as an aside, humility's sibling virtue would actually be confidence. They would work together. You need both. Humility and Christianity connect in that the Christian meta-narrative says that you are created good, and yet you are also broken. And so humility helps us to have a realistic view of ourselves. How can leaders cultivate humility in their teams? You gotta name it when you see it or when you need it. You can model it by admitting your shortcomings. There's some interesting organizational, industrial, psychological research that has shown that when a leader is perceived to have low competency, being vulnerable about shortcomings is not actually that good of an idea because it really undermines your competence. However, when a leader is viewed to have very high competence, being vulnerable or perhaps a little bit self-deprecatory, or being honest about your shortcomings really elevates the view of the leader because it humanizes them, makes them seem warm and approachable. Accountability, the virtue of accountability is also related to humility in several ways. And last but not least, gratitude. Gratitude is recognizing oneself as a beneficiary of a benefit from a benevolent benefactor. So without all of the B words, that essentially means gratitude is appreciation of a good gift received. And how I think this plays out in sports is that gratitude helps us to appreciate what is good and what is still good when stuff is hard. We can have appreciation for our abilities and our opportunities and our relationships. Gratitude is the perfect balance of vicious excess of servitude and vicious deficiency of entitlement. And I think gratitude connects with Christianity because our whole existence and opportunity to know God in Christ is a gift. All of our life is a gift. And when we engage in gratitude and can reflect on the good gifts that the gifter has given, we also get to know the character of the gifter. So how can leaders cultivate gratitude in their teams? Name it when you see it. Name it when you need it. You as yourself as a leader can be grateful. There's a lot of little practices that you can add on to engage in gratitude. I remember another preseason with Baylor soccer, our head coach Paul Jobson, he asked all of our players to write on a sticky note 3 things they were grateful for and to slide it on his office door before each morning practice, just at like 6 a.m. And the girls did it, and you want to know what happened? They actually just kept doing it all season. Paul thought this would just be like a really good preseason activity, but once they got in the habit of it, they just kept doing it. I have that little photo of 3 sticky notes simply to say it doesn't take a lot of time to slip into your daily routine. Hey, what are 3 good things? There is a lot of empirical psychological evidence that gratitude interventions can be effective in elevating positive emotions and pro-social emotions. And little practices like, hey, what are 3 good things? Or, hey, everyone, let's each share 1 thing that we're grateful for. Or one particularly potent exercise is having people write a gratitude letter to someone and then delivering it and reading it out loud. And that is because gratitude is a very pro-social emotion. It connects us to each other. Gratitude is also really good for mental health. We have studies that show that gratitude is a virtue, is the strongest predictor of lower mental health, like mental health challenge symptoms like depression, anxiety, and stress. So sort of in conclusion, I have talked about what a virtue is and how it is cultivated within Christian contexts. I talked about how athletic contexts can either promote or hinder the development of virtues. We talked about leadership as a crucial variable as to whether sports will be a character-enhancing activity or not. And then we discussed 4 examples of virtues in sport. So I started our time with a story about a center forward who wanted more than anything a starting spot. And I want to end with a story about a young man who also had some really deep desires and allegiances. As Jesus was setting out on a journey, a man ran up and knelt down before him and asked, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus asked him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. And you know the commandments. Do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not defraud, honor your father and mother." And the man said to Jesus, "Teacher, I have kept all of these from my youth." And Jesus, looking at the man, loved the man. And he said to him, "You lack one thing. Go, sell all you have, give it to the poor, then you'll have treasure in heaven. And then come and follow me." But at this, the man's face fell, shocked and dismayed, and he went away grieving because he had many possessions. And so to wrap up I just want to highlight that this is Jesus as a leader. He sees us and he loves us, and he's calling us to a better way, to follow him. Thank you.